To understand how badly this went wrong, you have to understand the architecture of North American auto trade because most people get this completely backwards. People assume the US is the dominant seller. They assume Canada is just a smaller, colder version of America that occasionally buys a few Fords. That is not the reality. Canada is, or was, the single largest foreign buyer of American manufactured goods. Full stop. Not by a little, by a massive margin. In the first 3 quarters of 2024 alone, nearly $350 billion in goods and services crossed into Canada from the United States. That's more than any other country on earth was buying from America. In the auto sector specifically, the US ran a net surplus with Canada. That means America was selling more cars to Canada than Canada was selling to America. Canada was a profit center for Detroit, not a competitor. Here's the number that puts it in concrete terms. Approximately 40% of every new vehicle sold in Canada came from American factories. Out of 1.86 million new vehicles sold in Canada in 2024, nearly 750,000 of them were American-made. That's 750,000 vehicles crossing the border, generating dealer profits, factory wages, part supplier revenue, and executive bonuses across Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Alabama. This wasn't charity. Canada wasn't buying American cars because they had to. They bought them because the North American auto supply chain had been integrated for over 60 years. The same parts cross the US-Canada border up to 8 times before a vehicle is fully assembled. A transmission built in Windsor, Ontario, goes into an engine assembled in Detroit, which gets installed in a truck shipped to a dealership in Calgary. This wasn't 2 countries trading. It was one continental industry operating across a border. In April 2025, the Trump administration activated 25% Section 232 tariffs on automobiles and auto parts imported into the United States. But here's the part that flipped the equation. Canada immediately retaliated with its own 25% counter tariffs on American vehicles entering Canada. Overnight, every American car crossing into Canada became 25% more expensive for Canadian consumers. The economics that had held this market together for 6 decades cracked open. The auto industry will tell you tariffs take time to work through the system. That's true. But the financial damage was instant. General Motors reported absorbing $1.1 billion in tariff costs in a single quarter, with a full-year 2025 exposure of $4 to $5 billion. Ford took an $800 million hit in just 1 quarter. Stellantis warned of a $3.7 billion hit, covering only the first half of 2025. These aren't small numbers. Ford's entire annual profit in a good year is around $6 billion. A $3 billion tariff hit doesn't just dent the balance sheet. It cancels investment programs, freezes hiring plans, and triggers plant reviews. Brian Kingston, head of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, the body that represents Ford, GM, and Stellantis in Canada, put it plainly. Through 2025, manufacturers in Canada were exposed to approximately $5 billion in total tariff costs. His exact words, "You cannot have a commercially viable automotive plant in Canada facing tariffs of that size." That's not an economist at a think tank speculating. That's the chief representative of the Detroit Three in Canada saying the current structure is commercially unsuitable to survive. Here's where this story goes from bad to catastrophic. U.S. factories' share of the Canadian vehicle market just hit its lowest point in recorded modern history, 36%. That's down from a 10-year average of 49%. In raw terms, America went from supplying nearly half of every car sold in Canada to barely more than 1/3, and it's still falling. That gap, 13 percentage points across a market of 1.9 million vehicles annually, represents hundreds of thousands of units. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles that used to roll off American assembly lines, cross the border, and generate revenue for American companies. Gone. And Canadian auto exports back to the U.S. collapsed in parallel. Motor vehicles and parts exports fell 21.2% in a single month. Passenger car and light truck exports dropped 32.5%. These aren't percentage points you recover in a quarter. These are structural dislocations. Canadian auto production in 2025 dropped from 2.3 million units in 2016 to 1.2 million. That's nearly half the output erased, with the tariffs accelerating the final plunge. At the same time, Chinese auto production rose 10%. Chinese auto exports rose 21%. While America was fighting with its closest neighbor, Its real competitors, the ones who built entirely new EV platforms while Detroit was adjusting to tariff spreadsheets, were accelerating. That statistic should be hanging on the wall of every auto executive in Michigan. Canada's production cut in half, China's exports up 21% simultaneously. The tariffs didn't just make American cars more expensive in Canada, they pushed Canada into the arms of the one country the US has spent the last decade trying to shut out of Western markets. So America tariffed Canada. Canada retaliated. American cars got expensive in Canada. Canadian production collapsed. Detroit took billions in losses. That's the surface story. Here's what's underneath it. When Canada lost its largest trading partner's goodwill, when Washington made it commercially painful to keep doing business the old way, Ottawa didn't sit still. Canada did something that would have been politically unthinkable 3 years ago. It picked up the phone and called Beijing, and China answered immediately. In January 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney flew to Beijing and announced a landmark trade agreement with China. The headline was canola oil. Canada would lower tariffs on Chinese EVs, and China would slash tariffs on Canadian canola from 84% down to approximately 15%. Simple enough on the surface, but read the fine print and the strategic implications are staggering. Canada cut its tariff on Chinese electric vehicles from 100%, where it had been set to align with US and EU policy, all the way down to 6.1% on the first 49,000 vehicles per year, with the quota growing to 70,000 over 5 years. Let's put that in real numbers. At 6.1%, a BYD electric vehicle that costs $30,000 to import carries a $1,130 tariff. The same vehicle under the old 100% tariff costs $60,000 to land in Canada. That's not a price adjustment, that's a completely different product category. Chinese EVs went from being economically impossible to sell in Canada to being the most competitively priced vehicles in the country overnight. And the companies that had been waiting for exactly this moment did not hesitate. BYD, the Chinese EV manufacturer that outsold Tesla globally in 2023 and 2024, announced plans to open 20 branded dealerships across Canada within a single year. They hired a top Canadian automotive retail consultancy specifically to secure locations. 3 sites in the Greater Toronto area are already confirmed. Vancouver, Montreal, and Calgary are next. Geely began hiring 7 senior-level positions in Toronto: head of sales, head of marketing, head of legal, head of network development. Not junior staff, senior leadership. The kind of hiring you do when you're building a permanent market presence, not testing the waters. Chery, whose sub-brands include Omoda, JQ, and Exceed, already had 2 vehicles spotted on Ontario roads with manufacturer plates. They sent Canadian dealer representatives to the Beijing Auto Show. They filed trademark applications across multiple sub-brands in Canada simultaneously. And Tesla, yes, American Tesla, moved its Shanghai-built Model 3 into Canada at $39,490. That's roughly US $29,000. The cheapest Model 3 available in Canada 2 months earlier was $79,990, built at Fremont. Same car, half the price, because it came from China, not California. This is the direct consequence of the tariff war. Canada didn't choose China sentimentally, Canada chose China mathematically. Here's the part of this story that should genuinely concern anyone paying attention to where the auto industry is going over the next decade. Losing gas vehicle market share in Canada is painful. Losing EV market share in Canada is potentially permanent. Consider what's happening globally. 1 in every 4 vehicles sold worldwide in 2025 was electric. That number is only going one direction. The automaker that builds your first EV loyalty, the brand you learn to charge, to service, to trust, is the brand you stay with. EV switching costs are higher than gasoline vehicles because of charging infrastructure, software ecosystems, and service network familiarity. Canada's EV market is exactly the beachhead that Chinese manufacturers need to establish credibility in a Western, English-speaking, high-income democracy, right next door to the United States. If BYD builds 20 dealerships in Canada, trains 500 service technicians, locks in 50,000 satisfied EV customers, and generates 5 years of positive word of mouth, what does that do to their US market entry when Washington eventually opens that door? It gives them infrastructure, reputation, and proof of concept in a nearly identical consumer market. Canada is not just a car market. For Chinese automakers, Canada is a staging ground. And what did American manufacturers do while this was happening? Ford took a $19.5 billion write-down, scaling back its EV production plans. General Motors absorbed a $6 billion hit. EV supply chain investment in the U.S. was down 30% by the end of Q3 2025 compared to a year earlier. Investment that was supposed to build the next generation of American electric vehicles, canceled, delayed, or restructured because the tariff environment made the financial models unworkable. So the sequence looks like this. Trump tariffs Canada. Canada retaliates. American auto profits collapse. American EV investment gets cut. Canada opens its EV market to China. Chinese brands establish Western market credibility. American automakers fall further behind in the technology race they were already losing. Every step in that chain connects directly to the tariff decision made in April 2025. Now, layer on top of all of this the single most important deadline in North American trade history, July 1st, 2026. That's the mandatory review date for the USMCA, the trade agreement that governs $1.3 trillion in annual commerce between the US, Canada, and Mexico. Under the agreement's own terms, all three countries must meet on that date and decide: extend for 16 years, renegotiate, or begin a 10-year countdown to full expiration. The U.S. Trade Representative has already signaled publicly that he is not prepared to recommend renewal without additional concessions from Canada. Canada's chief trade negotiator has said she does not expect all issues to be resolved by July 1st. Canada and the U.S. have not yet entered formal negotiations. That means the agreement that currently shields most Canadian goods from the harshest tariffs, the framework that keeps automotive supply chains functioning across three countries, is heading into its review in a state of active, unresolved trade hostility. The USMCA is not just a trade deal. It is the legal architecture that allows a transmission to cross the border 8 times without triggering a tariff each time. It is the framework that makes a continental auto industry economically viable. Without it, or with a weakened version of it, the cost of building a single North American vehicle increases at every stage of production. Greg Mordew, an auto industry scholar at McMaster University, said it plainly. Putting any kind of tariffs on the auto sector would be a dismantling of 60 years of integrated North American manufacturing. Not a disruption, a dismantling. And 34 American states, states whose economies depend on selling goods to Canada more than to any other foreign country, are watching this deadline approach with no deal in sight, no formal negotiations started, and no public indication that Washington grasps the full exposure. So here is where we are. America tariffed its single largest auto export market. Canada retaliated. Detroit absorbed billions in losses. Chinese manufacturers walked into the gap with dealer networks, senior hires, and vehicles priced at levels American brands structurally cannot match. The USMCA review deadline is 45 days away with no deal on the table. Who actually pays for all of this? The answer is not Ottawa, it's not Beijing, it's not even the executives in Detroit who are absorbing the write-downs. The people who pay for a trade war are always the same people, the ones who never voted on it, never negotiated it, and never saw it coming. When a 25% tariff hits an imported vehicle, that cost does not disappear into a government account and quietly fund infrastructure. It travels. It moves through the supply chain and eventually arrives on a window sticker at a dealership near you. Cox Automotive estimated that by the time 2025 model year tariff costs fully work through the market, American consumers would see retail prices climb between 4% and 8% on a $45,000 vehicle, which is now the average new car transaction price in the United States. That's between $1,800 and $3,600 in added cost per vehicle. Not because the car got better, because a trade policy made it more expensive to build. And it doesn't stop at the sticker. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, and auto parts raise the cost of every vehicle, including ones assembled entirely inside the United States. The moment you tariff the raw materials and components that feed American factories, you raise the cost of American production. There is no version of broad auto tariffs that leaves domestically built vehicles untouched. The supply chain is too integrated for that. GM said it plainly in earnings calls. Pricing remains stable near-term because automakers were absorbing the costs themselves rather than passing them immediately to consumers. Ford said the same. But absorbing billions in tariff costs is not a permanent strategy. It's a bridge, and that bridge has an end. When Ford absorbs $3 billion in tariff costs, it cuts somewhere else. It delays an EV program. It restructures a plant. It reduces its capital expenditure forecast. Every dollar absorbed by the manufacturer is a dollar not invested in the next generation of vehicles. The vehicles that will determine whether American brands remain competitive over the next decade against companies like BYD, which is investing aggressively in battery technology, manufacturing scale, and now Western market infrastructure. The American consumer doesn't feel this immediately. They feel it in 3 years when the car they want isn't available, or when the American brand they've driven for 20 years no longer has a competitive electric option in their price range. This trade war has geography, and the geography is specific. Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama. These are the states where the American auto industry physically lives. These are the states where a plant closing isn't an economic statistic. It's a town. Windsor, Ontario, directly across the river from Detroit, houses the Stellantis Windsor Assembly Plant, one of the highest volume minivan production facilities in North America. The Ambassador Bridge connecting Windsor to Detroit sees over 2.2 million truck crossings annually, a significant share of which are auto manufacturing related. That single crossing handles more trade value than most U.S. land ports combined. When Canadian auto production fell from 2.3 million units in 2016 to 1.2 million in 2025, those weren't just Canadian jobs that disappeared. The parts suppliers, the logistics companies, the tool and die shops on the American side of that supply chain, they lost orders too. The Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association confirmed approximately 3,000 workers affected at Stellantis Brampton alone, 1,200 at the CAMI assembly plant in Ingersoll, and thousands more in parts and supply chain roles. Lana Payne, national president of Unifor, the union representing those workers, said something that cuts through the political noise entirely. Trump called these tariffs liberation. Her response? The only thing liberated was auto workers, liberated from their good union jobs on both sides of the border. That framing matters. Because the political narrative sold these tariffs as protecting American workers. The actual outcome was disrupting an integrated supply chain that employed Americans and Canadians simultaneously, and the disruption cost both sides. Meanwhile, as Canadian production declined and American brands lost Canadian market share, Chinese auto production rose 10% and Chinese exports jumped 21%. The competitors did not pause while America and Canada fought. They accelerated. Can the Canadian market be recovered? The honest answer is partially and not quickly. The gas vehicle market is recoverable if the USMCA review produces a workable agreement by July 1st. If tariffs come down, Canadian consumers will return to American brands because the quality and familiarity are there. The 60-year relationship doesn't evaporate permanently over a 2-year trade dispute, but it does require a credible resolution, and the clock is running. The EV market is a different story. Once BYD has 20 dealerships operating in Canada, once Geely has senior staff embedded in Toronto, once 50,000 Canadians have bought and charged and recommended Chinese EVs to their neighbors, that market share does not come back automatically when a trade deal gets signed. Consumer loyalty in the EV segment is stickier than in gas vehicles because of the ecosystem lock-in. Charging hardware, software updates, service relationships, these create switching costs that political agreements cannot dissolve. This is why the timing matters so much. The window to prevent permanent structural loss in the Canadian EV market is not years away. It is right now. Every month that BYD spends building dealerships in Toronto is a month that Ford and GM are not building those relationships. That gap compounds. The USMCA review is the last clear mechanism available to course correct before the structural damage becomes irreversible. Canada's chief trade negotiator has said the July 1st deadline will not cause the agreement to collapse, but she has also said all outstanding issues will not be resolved by then. That middle ground, agreement survives but tariffs persist, is the worst possible outcome for American automakers. It preserves the legal framework but leaves the economic damage running. Mark Carney has been clear. This is not a negotiation where the United States dictates terms. Canada has leverage, energy, critical minerals, hydropower, integrated supply chains, and Carney has shown he is willing to use it. Whether that shift happens before July 1st determines whether the story ends as a painful but recoverable episode or a permanent realignment of North American economic architecture. Here is the financial summary for anyone making decisions based on this situation. The American auto industry is absorbing real, quantified losses. $4 to $5 billion at GM, $3 billion at Ford, $3.7 billion at Stellantis in a single half year. These are not projections. These are reported earnings figures from public companies. American EV investment is contracting, down 30%, at the exact moment Chinese EV manufacturers are expanding into adjacent Western markets and building the infrastructure that enables future U.S. market entry. The USMCA review on July 1st is the single most consequential trade event of 2026 for the North American auto sector. And the Canadian consumer, who used to buy American cars at a rate of 49% market share, is now buying them at 36% and declining, with Chinese brands actively filling the space. The tariff was designed to protect American industry. The outcome, measured in real dollars, real market share, and real strategic positioning, has been the opposite. America taxed its own best customer, handed its fiercest competitor a market opening, weakened its manufacturers' balance sheets, and now faces a trade agreement review with no negotiation yet formally underway. That is not an opinion. That is the sequence of documented, publicly reported events. And the financial consequences are still unfolding.